gate opened with a sound like a groan, and Kale was pushed forward before he could steady his feet. He stumbled into the dirt yard, dust rising around his knees, and behind him, the gate slammed shut with a heavy clang that echoed off the stone walls. His hands were still tied loosely at the wrists, more for show than for strength, because everyone in Thornridge Pack knew he could not fight back even if he tried. He had no wolf inside him. He was Kale, the Omega without a shift, the one they called Wolfless behind cupped hands and sometimes to his face without any shame at all. He turned his head slowly, and what he saw made his chest tighten. 6 pups crouched in the far corner of the enclosure, their fur matted, their ribs showing beneath patchy coats, their eyes wild with something that was not quite hunger and not quite fear, but a mixture of both that made them dangerous. These were not pack pups raised with warmth and milk and gentle hands. These were feral pups, orphaned and abandoned, kept here as a test, a punishment, a warning to anyone who dared to be different. Kale had heard the whispers all morning. Elder Corwin wanted to see what would happen if something soft was placed in front of something broken. He wanted to see if the pups would tear it apart. He wanted to prove once and for all that Kale was worth nothing to the pack, not even worth feeding, only worth throwing away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the pups toward him, sour and unwashed, and one of the smaller pups let out a low growl that vibrated through the quiet yard. Kale did not run. He knew running would be the end of him. A moving body only invited a chase, and a chase only ended one way in a yard this small. So instead, he lowered himself to the ground, slow and deliberate, ignoring the sharp bite of gravel against his knees, and he folded his tied hands into his lap. The pups watched him. Above the enclosure, hidden behind a row of iron bars meant to keep the pups contained but not meant to keep prying eyes away, a small crowd of Thornridge Pack members had gathered. Kale could hear their murmurs even from here, low and excited, the way people sound when they expect to witness something terrible and cannot look away from the thought of it. He had grown used to being watched like this. His whole life had been an audience waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to prove that a wolf without a shift was not truly a wolf at all, just an empty shell wearing the pack's name. The largest pup, a male with a torn ear and eyes the color of wet stone, took one careful step forward, then another. His paws barely made a sound against the packed earth, but Kale felt each step in his own pulse, a slow countdown ticking somewhere behind his ribs. He did not close his eyes. He did not look away. Instead, he began to hum. It was not a song with words, not anything he could have named if someone had asked him to explain it. It was simply a sound that rose up from somewhere old inside him, low and steady, the kind of sound a mother might make to settle a crying child, the kind of sound that had no place in a yard built for violence. The torn-eared pup stopped walking. His ears, one whole and one ragged, tilted forward, and his stone-colored eyes blinked slowly, as if the sound had reached somewhere deep and unexpected inside him. Behind him, the other pups shifted their weight, and one of the smallest, a female with a patch of white fur across her nose, let out a small whimper that was nothing like a growl at all. Kale kept humming. He did not know why it worked. He did not know why the pups, who by all accounts should have already closed the distance between them and torn into him without hesitation, instead stood frozen, caught somewhere between old instinct and something new that Kale himself did not understand. All he knew was that his hands were shaking, that his heart was pounding hard enough to hurt, and that somehow, impossibly, the pups were listening. From behind the iron bars, the murmuring crowd had gone quiet. Elder Corwin, a broad man with silver threading through his beard and a permanent frown carved into the lines of his face, leaned forward against the railing, his knuckles whitening around the metal. This was not the outcome he had planned. He had expected blood, or at the very least, panic. He had expected Kale to scream, to beg, to prove that he was as weak as everyone already believed him to be. Instead, the yard had gone still, and 6 feral pups were slowly, one by one, lowering themselves onto their bellies in front of a boy with no wolf at all. Kale's humming softened, and he let his tied hands rest open on the ground, palms facing upward, an offering with nothing to offer. The torn-eared pup crept forward again, sniffing carefully at the air between them, and when he finally reached Kale's hand, he did not bite. He pressed his nose against Kale's palm and huffed out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Somewhere above them, a gasp rippled through the crowd. Kale allowed himself, for just a moment, to breathe. He did not know how long the pups had been kept in this yard, alone, without their mother, without the warmth of a den or the comfort of a pack that wanted them. He did not know what had been done to make them feral in the first place. Only that ferocity like this rarely grew on its own. Something had shaped them. Something had hurt them long before Kale ever arrived. The smallest pup, the one with the white patch across her nose, crawled forward next, hesitant, her belly low to the ground. And when she reached Cale's knee, she pressed herself against him, the way a lost thing presses against anything warm. Cale let his hand rest gently on her back, and she did not flinch away. He had spent years being told that gentleness was a weakness, that a wolf without teeth or claws or the ability to shift was worthless in a pack built on strength. He had believed it, some days, in the quiet hours when the whispers followed him even into sleep. But here, in this yard meant to end him, gentleness was the only language that had worked. The murmuring above grew louder again, no longer hushed with anticipation but sharp with confusion, and Cale heard Elder Corwin's voice cut through it, low and hard, ordering someone to fetch him at once. Before Cale could process the command, the heavy gate at the far end of the yard groaned open once more, but this time it was not another push from behind. It was someone new, someone whose presence changed the air itself, thick and charged, the way the sky feels just before a storm breaks. Cale did not turn immediately. He kept his hand steady on the small pup's back, kept his breathing slow, because sudden movement now might undo whatever fragile trust he had built in the last few minutes. But he felt eyes on him, heavier and more focused than the crowd's had been, eyes that did not belong to Thornridge at all. When he finally turned his head, he saw a man standing just inside the gate, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed simply, but carrying himself with the kind of authority that needed no crown or title to be recognized. His eyes were dark, and they were fixed not on Cale, but on the pups gathered calmly around him. The man's expression shifted from something unreadable into something that looked almost like disbelief. Cale did not know it yet, but the pups in this yard were not simply abandoned strays picked up off the road. They carried a bloodline stolen weeks earlier during a raid on a neighboring territory, a bloodline this man had been searching for ever since, believing them lost, believing them perhaps already gone. And here they were, calm and curled against a boy the world had called broken. The man stepped further into the yard, his boots silent against the packed dirt, his gaze moving slowly from the torn-eared pup pressed against Cale's hand to the smallest one tucked against his knee, and finally to Cale's face, searching it as though looking for an answer to a question he had not yet learned how to ask. Cale felt his pulse quicken again, but this time it was not fear of the pups. It was fear of what came next. Behind the bars, Elder Corwin's voice rose in protest, demanding to know why an outsider had been allowed inside the enclosure without permission, but the man did not seem to hear him at all. His attention remained entirely on Cale, steady and searching, as if the rest of the yard, the rest of the pack, the rest of the world, had simply fallen away. "You did this," the man said quietly, not quite a question. Cale's mouth went dry. He did not know how to answer, because he was not entirely sure what he had done either. All he knew was that the pups, wild and dangerous only minutes ago, now lay calm around him, and that the man standing before him looked less like someone about to punish him, and more like someone who had just uncovered something he had spent a long time searching for. The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, and for the first time in longer than Cale could remember, the eyes watching him did not carry mockery or disgust. They carried something that felt, impossibly, like wonder. Draven had traveled 3 days to reach Thornridge territory, following a trail of rumors that had grown thinner with every mile. Word had spread across the northern packs about a strange group of feral pups being kept in a border enclosure, pups too aggressive to approach, pups that snarled at anyone who came near. He had almost dismissed the story as exaggeration, one more tale twisted by distance and fear, but something in the description had stopped him cold. A torn ear on the largest pup, a white patch across the muzzle of the smallest, details that matched too closely to be coincidence. Now, standing in this dusty yard, watching those same pups curl peacefully around a boy with tied wrists and no wolf inside him, Draven felt the last of his doubt collapse into certainty. These were his pups, stolen during the raid on his eastern border weeks ago, taken along with 3 of his warriors who never made it home. He had searched every territory within a week's travel, following whispers and half-truths, refusing to believe they were simply gone. And here they were, alive, thin but alive, curled against a stranger, as if he were the safest thing they had ever known. "You did this," he said again, quieter this time, because the boy in front of him had not answered, and Draven realized the silence was not defiance, it was disbelief. Cale swallowed hard before he spoke. "I didn't do anything, I just sat down." It was such a simple answer, almost embarrassingly plain, and yet Draven understood immediately that it was the truth. The boy had not commanded the pups, had not used force or fear or any trick that Draven recognized. He had simply lowered himself to their level and offered stillness in a world that had only ever offered them violence. Above the enclosure, Elder Corwin's voice grew louder, sharper, demanding answers Draven had no intention of giving him yet. Draven did not even glance up. His focus remained on the pups and on the boy who held them without holding them at all. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements unhurried, and extended one hand toward the torn-eared pup. The pup, who moments earlier had bared his teeth at anyone who dared approach the gate, sniffed cautiously at Draven's fingers before letting out a soft huff of recognition. His tail, thin and matted, gave one small wag. "He knows you," Cale said, watching closely. "He should. I raised him from the day he was born." Draven's voice carried something rough underneath it, something that sounded almost like grief held carefully at bay. All of them. Their mother was killed in the same raid that took them. Cale's chest tightened at that. He looked down at the small pup still pressed against his knee, the one with the white patch, and understood suddenly why her whimpers had sounded less like fear and more like grief. She was not simply afraid. She was mourning, in the only way a pup could mourn, curling toward warmth because the warmth she once knew had been taken from her. "They stopped eating," Draven continued, his jaw tightening. "The keepers here said they wouldn't take food from anyone's hand, said they'd gone feral beyond saving." "They're not feral," Cale said quietly. "They're scared." Draven looked up at him then, really looked, and something shifted behind his dark eyes. It was such an obvious thing to say, and yet Draven understood in that moment that no one in Thornridge had bothered to consider it. To them, the pups were simply a tool, useful only as a threat or a lesson, their suffering irrelevant next to whatever purpose they served. The gate at the top of the yard creaked open again, and Elder Corwin descended the narrow stairs himself, his expression tight with barely restrained anger. 2 Thornridge guards followed close behind him, hands resting on the hilts of blades they clearly hoped they would not need to use. "You have no right to be in this enclosure," Corwin said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. "This is Thornridge territory, and this exercise is Thornridge business." Draven rose to his full height, and even without shifting, without raising his voice, the air around him seemed to thicken with quiet authority. "These pups belong to Ironfang bloodline. Stolen during a raid on my border 3 weeks ago. I have every right to reclaim what is mine." Corwin's frown deepened, though something flickered behind his eyes that looked almost like alarm. "We received them through trade. Legitimate trade. If you have a grievance, take it up with the traders who sold them, not with me." "I intend to." Draven's tone left no room for argument. "But first, I intend to take them home." Cale watched the exchange with a growing unease settling in his stomach. He understood, distantly, that whatever happened next would not include him. He was simply the boy who happened to be standing in the yard when the pups calmed down, a footnote in whatever story Draven would tell once he returned to his own territory. The pups would leave with their rightful alpha, and Cale would return to whatever life Thornridge still allowed him, a life of whispers and averted eyes, and the quiet certainty that he would always be less than everyone around him. He began, carefully, to shift the smallest pup off his knee, preparing to stand, preparing to disappear back into the background where he belonged. The pup would not move. She pressed herself tighter against him instead, letting out a thin, distressed sound, and beside her the torn-eared pup rose to his feet and pressed his body against Cale's other side, as if forming a wall between him and the world. "They won't leave him," one of the Thornridge guards muttered, low enough that he probably thought no one would hear. But everyone heard. Draven's gaze moved slowly from the pups back to Cale, and Cale felt that same searching look from before, except now, it carried something new, something calculating, though not unkind. "How long have you had a bond with a wolf?" Draven asked. "I don't have a wolf," Cale said, the old shame rising automatically to his throat, the way it always did when the subject came up. "I never shifted, not once. I'm wolfless." "That's not what I asked." Cale blinked, uncertain how to answer a question that seemed to contradict the very fact of his existence. He had spent his whole life being defined by what he lacked, by the absence of a shift, by the empty space where a wolf should have been. No one had ever asked him about a bond, because everyone assumed a bond required a wolf to begin with. Draven crouched again, this time beside Cale rather than the pups, close enough that Cale could see the fine details of exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the weariness of a man who had spent 3 sleepless days chasing a thread of hope that might have led nowhere. "There are old bloodlines," Draven said quietly, "that carry a different kind of gift, not a shift, something quieter, the ability to calm a wolf's mind, even a wild one, even one that's lost everything. He paused, studying Kale's face, as though searching for confirmation of a suspicion he had not yet dared to fully believe. I've only read about it in old records. I never thought I'd see it. Elder Corwin let out a short, humorless laugh. He's an Omega with no shift. Nothing more. Don't waste your time on old wives' tales. But Draven was not listening to Corwin anymore. He was watching the way the pups leaned into Kale, the way their thin bodies had gone slack with something like safety for the first time in weeks, and he was beginning to understand that the boy in front of him was not broken at all. He was something Thornridge had never bothered to look closely enough to see. I'm taking the pups home, Draven said, rising to his feet, and the boy comes with them. Corwin's face went through several shades of disbelief before settling into something colder. He is not yours to take. He belongs to Thornridge. By your own pack law, Draven said evenly. Any bond formed between an Omega and a bloodline's pups falls under that bloodline's protection. I know your laws, Corwin. I made sure to before I walked through that gate. The silence that followed was heavy enough that Kale could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He looked between Draven's steady certainty and Corwin's tightening fury, and for the first time in his life, he realized he was standing in the middle of something far larger than himself, something that might, for once, end in his favor instead of against it. The smallest pup nuzzled closer against his side, and Kale, almost without meaning to, reached down and rested his hand gently against her back once more. Whatever happened next, he was no longer alone in that yard. The argument that followed lasted longer than Kale expected, though he understood very little of the legal language being thrown back and forth above his head. Words like bloodline claim and border treaty and pack precedent passed between Draven and Elder Corwin like weapons neither man was willing to lower first, while the two Thornridge guards stood uncertain, clearly unused to seeing their elder challenged so directly. Kale stayed low in the dirt, surrounded by pups who refused to let him move, and tried to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible, a habit built over years of learning that attention rarely brought him anything good. But this time, the attention would not let him disappear. The boy stays here, Corwin said finally, his voice hard as stone. He is Thornridge property, born within these walls, and no outside law changes that. He is not property, Draven said, his voice dropping into something dangerously calm, and if you continue to speak of him that way in front of me, you will find out exactly how little patience I have left. Corwin's guards shifted uneasily, exchanging a glance that suggested they too understood the wisdom in not testing that patience further. It was another voice that finally broke the standoff, one Kale had not expected to hear. Elder Corwin, a woman's voice, calm but firm, came from the top of the stairs where the crowd had gathered earlier. Kale recognized her as one of the pack's senior healers, a woman named Miriam who had, on rare occasions, treated Kale's small injuries without the disgust most others showed him. The Alpha King's claim is not baseless. The bloodline protection law is old, but it has never been repealed. If we deny it outright, we invite conflict with Ironfang that this pack cannot currently afford. Corwin's jaw worked silently for a moment, clearly torn between pride and practicality. Kale watched the calculation happen behind the elder's eyes, watched him weigh the cost of losing face against the cost of losing far more in an actual conflict with a neighboring Alpha King. Fine, Corwin said at last, the word bitten off sharp and short. Take the Wolfless one. He's brought us nothing but embarrassment since the day he was born anyway. The words landed exactly where they were meant to, a final small cruelty aimed at reminding Kale of his place, even as he was being sent away from it. Kale felt the old familiar sting rise in his chest, but he kept his face still, kept his hands steady against the small pup's back, refusing to give Corwin the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Draven, however, did react. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment Kale thought he might say something sharp in return, might defend him the way no one in Thornridge ever had, but instead, Draven simply turned away from Corwin entirely, as if the elder's words held no more weight than the dust settling around their feet. Come, Draven said, extending a hand toward Kale. Let's get them somewhere safe. Kale hesitated only a moment before taking the offered hand, allowing himself to be pulled gently to his feet. The moment he stood, the pups rose with him, refusing to separate even by a few inches, forming a loose, protective circle around his legs that made walking awkward but not impossible. The walk out of the enclosure felt different from the walk in, where before Kale had been pushed forward with his wrists bound, expected to disappear quietly into whatever fate the pups decided for him. Now he walked upright, surrounded by small, warm bodies that trusted him, beside a man whose presence alone seemed to make the crowd part without needing to be asked. Someone finally cut the rope binding his wrists. and Kale rubbed at the raw skin absently, still trying to process the sudden shift in his circumstances. An hour ago he had been thrown away. Now he was being led out through the front gates of the only home he had ever known, toward a future he could not begin to imagine. Outside the walls, a small group of Iron Fang warriors waited with horses and a covered wagon, clearly prepared for the possibility of bringing the pups back injured or too weak to travel on their own. When they saw Draven emerge with all 6 pups alive and calm, several of them exchanged looks of stunned relief. "Alpha," one of them said, stepping forward, a lean man with sharp eyes named Finn, who Kale would later learn served as Draven's beta. We'd heard the pups had turned feral beyond recovery." "They had," Draven said, glancing back at Kale with an expression that was difficult to read. "Until now." Finn's gaze moved to Kale, taking in his tied wrists now freed, his simple clothes marked with the dust of the yard, the pups pressed close around his legs. Something like understanding passed briefly across his face, though he said nothing further, simply nodding once before helping load the pups gently into the wagon. Kale found himself lifted into the wagon alongside them, the pups immediately arranging themselves around him, as though he were the only anchor keeping them steady in an unfamiliar world. He sat quietly amid the soft warmth of 6 small bodies, watching through the wagon's open flap as Thornridge's walls grew smaller and smaller behind them. He did not know if he should feel relief or fear. Everything he had ever known lay behind those walls, and everything ahead of him was uncertain. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, the uncertainty did not feel entirely bad. Draven rode alongside the wagon rather than ahead of it, his expression thoughtful, occasionally glancing back to check on the pups, though Kale suspected he was checking on more than just the pups. "You didn't have to defend me back there," Kale said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over the journey. "Corwin was right, in a way. I am Wolfless. Whatever you think you saw in that yard, it doesn't change what I am." Draven's gaze sharpened, and he brought his horse closer to the wagon's edge. "What you are," he said, "is someone 6 pups trusted with their lives after everyone else failed them. That's not nothing, Kale. That's not close to nothing." Kale did not know how to respond to that, so he simply looked down at the smallest pup curled in his lap, her breathing slow and even for the first time since he had met her. "What's her name?" he asked instead, needing somewhere else to place his attention. "She doesn't have one yet," Draven admitted. "None of them do. They were taken before we had the chance." Something in that admission settled heavily in Kale's chest. These pups had lost their mother, their home, and even the simple dignity of a name, all within the same violent week. No wonder they had turned feral. No wonder they had trusted no one, until a boy with no wolf sat down in the dirt and hummed a wordless song into the silence. "Then maybe," Kale said slowly, "we should give them one." Draven studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his dark eyes, before a small, genuine smile finally broke across his tired face. "I'd like that," he said. "I think they would too." The wagon rolled onward, carrying them further from Thornridge with every passing mile, and Kale, surrounded by pups who had chosen him without hesitation, allowed himself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to belong somewhere at last. The journey to Iron Fang territory took 2 full days, and by the time the stone towers of Draven's stronghold rose against the horizon, Kale had already given the smallest pup a name. He called her Wisp, because she moved so quietly, slipping between the other pups like a thread of smoke that never quite settled in one place. The torn-eared pup he named Ash, for the gray patches scattered across his coat, and slowly, one by one, the others received names too, until all 6 pups had something of their own to answer to for the first time in their short lives. The stronghold itself was larger than anything Kale had ever seen. Thornridge had been modest, functional, built more for survival than for pride, but Iron Fang's walls rose high and solid, carved from pale stone that caught the afternoon light and held it. Guards stationed along the top of the walls straightened as Draven's party approached, and by the time the wagon rolled through the front gates, a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by whispers that their alpha had returned with the stolen pups alive. Kale felt every eye shift toward him the moment he stepped down from the wagon, pups trailing close around his ankles. He recognized the look on their faces immediately, because he had seen it his entire life. Confusion, suspicion, the silent question of what a stranger with no visible rank was doing standing so close to their alpha. He straightened his shoulders anyway and told himself he had survived worse than curious stares. "This is Kale," Draven announced, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "Without him, the pups would not have survived what was done to them. He'll be staying here, under my protection." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, quiet but unmistakable. Cale caught fragments of it, whispered words like Wolfless and outsider that felt uncomfortably familiar, though here they carried curiosity rather than open contempt. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, older than Draven, with silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly and sharp, assessing eyes. She studied Cale for a long moment, before turning her attention to the pups circling him. "Elena," Draven said, by way of introduction, "our healer. She'll want to check them over." Elena crouched slowly, extending a hand toward Ash, who sniffed cautiously, before allowing her fingers to brush against his torn ear. "They're thin," she said, her voice clinical but not unkind. "But alive. That's more than I expected, given what the reports described." "They wouldn't be," Draven said quietly, "if not for him." Elena's gaze flicked up to Cale, studying him with the same careful attention she had given the pups. "You're the one who calmed them." "I just sat with them," Cale said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I don't know why it worked." "I might," Elena said, straightening. "Come with me. There's something I'd like to check, if you're willing." Cale glanced at Draven, uncertain, and Draven gave a small nod of encouragement. "Go on. Elena knows more about bloodlines and old gifts than anyone in this territory. If there's an answer, she'll find it." Cale followed her across the courtyard, the pups trailing after him in a loose, watchful cluster, unwilling to let more than a few feet of distance grow between them and the boy who had become, in the space of 2 days, the only steady thing in their unraveling world. Elena led him into a low stone building near the edge of the courtyard, its interior lined with shelves of dried herbs, glass jars, and carefully labeled scrolls that looked old enough to crumble at a careless touch. She gestured for him to sit on a wooden bench near the window, and the pups arranged themselves around his feet, finally allowing themselves to settle now that the long journey was over. "Tell me," Elena said, pulling a stool opposite him, "when did you first know you couldn't shift?" Cale's shoulders tensed automatically, the old shame rising before he could stop it. "I was young, 6, maybe 7. Every other pup in the pack had already had their first shift by then. I never did. The elders said I never would." "And did anyone ever test why?" The question caught him off guard. "Test? Bloodlines don't simply vanish," Elena said, reaching for one of the older scrolls on her shelf, unrolling it carefully across her lap. "Every wolf carries a lineage, and every lineage carries a gift, even if that gift isn't always a shift. Did Thornridge ever examine your bloodline records?" Cale shook his head slowly. "They just called me Wolfless. Broken. No one ever looked deeper than that." Elena's mouth tightened into a thin line, something like quiet anger flickering behind her eyes before she smoothed her expression back into careful neutrality. "That doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. Many packs stopped keeping proper bloodline records generations ago, especially for lines they considered lesser. It made it easier to dismiss omegas like you without ever having to explain why." She turned the scroll toward him, revealing faded illustrations of wolves surrounded by calm, gathered pups, their postures relaxed in a way that felt immediately, uncannily familiar. "This is the Hearthbound line," Elena said. "One of the oldest bloodlines recorded, though most believed it extinct generations ago. Hearthbound omegas rarely shift, and when they do, it comes late, sometimes not until their gift has already matured fully. Their true strength was never in their claws or teeth. It was in their ability to calm a wolf's mind, even a mind broken by grief or violence, simply through presence and voice." Cale stared down at the illustration, at the careful ink strokes depicting a scene almost identical to the one that had played out in Thornridge's enclosure only 2 days earlier. "You think that's what I am?" "I think," Elena said carefully, "that 6 feral pups who had refused food and comfort from anyone for weeks, calmed the moment you sat beside them and started humming. I don't believe in coincidence that large." Cale's hands trembled slightly where they rested against his knees, and Wisp, sensing his unease, pressed her small body more firmly against his ankle, grounding him without either of them fully understanding why. "If that's true," Cale said slowly, "then why did Thornridge never see it? Why did they only ever see Wolfless?" Elena's expression softened, though the sadness beneath it remained. "Because it was easier for them not to look. A pack that discovers a rare bloodline in an omega they've spent years mistreating has to face what that mistreatment cost them. It's simpler to keep calling something broken than to admit you never bothered to understand it." The words settled heavily in Cale's chest, familiar and painful, in a way that felt almost like grief for a version of himself that could have existed, had anyone cared enough to look closer years earlier. He thought of every whispered insult, every averted gaze, every year spent believing he was simply less than everyone around him, and wondered how much of it might have been different. It's not your fault, Elena said gently, seeming to read the direction of his thoughts. None of it. You were a child who deserved better than what you were given. The fact that you survived it with this much gentleness still intact says more about your strength than any shift ever could. Kale looked down at Ash, who had settled his chin across Kale's foot, breathing slow and even, trusting completely. He thought about the years of being told he was worthless, and he thought about the way 6 abandoned pups had chosen him without hesitation the moment he offered them nothing but stillness and warmth. Maybe Elena was right. Maybe strength had never needed to look the way Thornridge insisted it must. Outside the window, the courtyard had begun to settle into evening quiet, torches being lit along the walls as the sun dipped low behind the stone towers. Kale realized, with a small jolt of surprise, that for the first time since the gate had opened onto that dusty yard 2 days ago, he did not feel like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. He felt, cautiously, like he might finally be somewhere safe. Word of Kale's gift spread through the Iron Fang stronghold faster than he expected, though not in the way he had braced himself for. He had grown used to whispers that carried scorn, the kind that followed him through hallways and made him shrink smaller with every step. Here, the whispers carried something closer to fascination, and it left him unsteady, unsure how to stand in a version of attention that did not immediately threaten him. Finn, Draven's beta, found him on the 3rd morning sitting near the training yard, watching a group of young warriors practice with wooden blades while the 6 pups dozed in a loose pile around him. Finn approached carefully, the way someone might approach an unfamiliar animal, though his expression carried more curiosity than caution. They still won't leave your side, Finn observed, settling onto the low stone wall beside him. Not even to eat unless you're nearby. They will, eventually, Kale said, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. They just need time. Elena thinks the bond might be permanent. Finn's tone was careful, testing. Hearthbound bonds, once formed, don't fade easily. Sometimes they don't fade at all. Kale's chest tightened at the thought, though he wasn't sure if the feeling was fear or something closer to hope. He had spent his whole life being told that no one would ever choose to stay close to him, and now 6 small creatures had attached themselves to him so thoroughly that even a full day's journey hadn't loosened their grip. Is that a problem? Kale asked carefully. For the pack, I mean. If they're bonded to me instead of to Iron Fang's alpha line. Finn considered the question seriously before answering. Draven doesn't see it that way. He sees 6 pups who are alive and healing instead of dead or lost forever. Whatever bond made that possible, he's grateful for it, not threatened by it. Kale glanced toward the training yard, where Draven himself stood instructing a younger warrior on proper footing. His movements precise and patient despite the weight clearly still sitting on his shoulders from the loss of the 3 warriors killed during the raid that had taken the pups in the first place. He lost people in that raid, Kale said quietly. I heard the guards mention it on the journey here. Finn's expression sobered. 3 of our best. Draven trained 2 of them himself, since they were pups barely out of their first shift. He doesn't talk about it much, but I know it weighs on him. Getting the pups back alive doesn't undo that loss, but it's not nothing either. Kale thought about that for a long moment, watching Draven move through the training yard with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of carrying responsibility too heavy for any one person to hold comfortably. He understood suddenly that Draven's search for the pups had never been simple duty. It had been an attempt to salvage something, anything, from a loss that had already cost him too much. Why did you agree to bring me here? Kale asked, the question surfacing before he fully decided to ask it. You could have taken the pups and left me at Thornridge. No one would have questioned that. Finn was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. Draven doesn't leave debts unpaid, and whatever you did in that yard, it saved something he thought was already gone. That's not a debt he takes lightly. Before Kale could respond, a commotion near the stronghold's main gate drew both their attention. A rider approached at speed, dust rising behind his horse, and the guards atop the wall called out an alert that sent several warriors moving quickly toward the entrance. Kale rose to his feet instinctively, the pups stirring awake around him, their ears pricking toward the sudden tension rippling through the courtyard. The rider, breathless and travel-worn, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and moved quickly toward Draven, who had already abandoned the training session to meet him halfway. Alpha, the rider said, his voice tight with urgency. Word from the border. Thornridge has been asking questions about the boy, sending scouts near our territory line, more than usual. Draven's expression darkened, the earlier patience in his posture, replaced with something harder, more alert. What kind of questions? Whether the bond is confirmed, whether the bloodline claim holds under scrutiny from the wider pack council. The rider hesitated before continuing. There's talk that Elder Corwin regrets releasing him so easily. now that word of the Hearthbound line has started spreading. Kale's stomach dropped, the fragile sense of safety he had begun building over the past 3 days suddenly feeling much thinner than before. He had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that once he crossed into Ironfang territory, Thornridge's reach ended at the border. He understood now, watching the tension settle across Draven's face, that assumption had been dangerously naive. "They can't reclaim him," Finn said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "The bloodline protection law is clear." "Laws only hold as much weight as the packs willing to enforce them," Draven said grimly. He turned toward Kale, his dark eyes searching his face with an intensity that made Kale's pulse quicken. "Did Corwin say anything else, before we left? Anything that suggested he understood what your bloodline meant?" Kale thought back to the yard, to Corwin's dismissive words about wasting time on old wives' tales, and shook his head slowly. He didn't believe it. He called it nonsense. "Then someone convinced him otherwise, after we left," Draven said. "Someone who understood exactly what a Hearthbound bond could mean for a pack desperate enough to use it." The implication settled over the courtyard like a physical weight. A Hearthbound Omega was not simply a curiosity or a rare bloodline worth documenting in old scrolls. In the wrong hands, someone with Kale's gift could calm an army of wolves before a battle, could soothe the aggression out of warriors meant to fight, could be used as a weapon disguised as gentleness. Kale had spent his whole life being told he was worth nothing. Now, apparently, he was suddenly worth a great deal, and the realization brought no comfort at all. "They won't get past our walls," Draven said, his voice firm, though Kale could see the calculation already happening behind his eyes, the mental preparation for a conflict he clearly hoped to avoid, but would not shy away from if it came. "But I want extra guards posted near the eastern wall regardless, and Kale doesn't leave the stronghold without an escort until this settles." The pups, sensing the shift in tension, pressed closer around Kale's legs, Ash letting out a low, uneasy sound that seemed to echo the unease settling in Kale's own chest. "I didn't want any of this," Kale said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "I just wanted to survive the yard. I never asked to become something worth fighting over." Draven's expression softened slightly, though the alertness in his posture didn't fade. "I know. But you are something worth protecting, Kale. That's not a burden you asked for, but it's not one you have to carry alone either." Kale looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the calculation or self-interest he had learned to expect from those in power, but found only steady, quiet resolve. For the first time since the gate had opened onto that dusty yard, Kale allowed himself to believe that whatever came next, he would not be facing it thrown away and alone. He would be facing it standing beside someone who had already chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside him first. The days that followed carried a tension Kale had never experienced before, one that hummed quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life rather than announcing itself loudly. Guards doubled along the eastern wall. Scouts rode out each morning and returned each evening with reports that grew slightly more concerning with every passing day. Thornridge had not attacked, had not even approached the border directly, but their scouts lingered close enough to make their interest impossible to ignore. Kale tried to keep himself useful during the waiting, spending his mornings with Elena in the small stone building lined with scrolls, learning slowly about the Hearthbound line and what it might mean for his future. Elena was patient with him, never once treating his questions as foolish, even when he asked things that felt embarrassingly basic to someone who had grown up surrounded by pack knowledge he had never been allowed access to. "The gift grows stronger with use," Elena explained one morning, watching as Kale sat cross-legged on the floor while all 6 pups dozed contentedly around him. Considerably healthier now than the thin, wild creatures he had first encountered in Thornridge's yard. "The more you use it, the more it settles into you. Some accounts suggest Hearthbound Omegas eventually gain a limited shift of their own, though it often comes far later than for other bloodlines, and it never carries the same aggression other shifts do." "So I might shift eventually?" Kale asked, unable to keep a note of disbelief from his voice. "Perhaps. There's no way to know for certain. Every Hearthbound line documented in these scrolls developed differently." Elena studied him carefully. "Does that possibility frighten you?" Kale considered the question honestly before answering. "I spent so long being told I never would. I don't know how to want something I've never let myself hope for." Elena's expression softened with understanding. "That's fair. Hope is a difficult thing to trust again once it's been taken from you early." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps outside, and moments later, Finn appeared in the doorway, his expression tight with barely restrained urgency. "Draven wants Kale brought to the main hall," Finn said. "Now." Kale's stomach dropped immediately, old instincts flaring at the sudden urgency in Finn's voice. The pups stirred awake around him, sensing his unease, and Ash rose immediately to press against his side as Kale got to his feet. "What's happened?" Elena asked, already moving to follow. "Thornridge sent an envoy," Finn said grimly. "They're requesting a formal audience. Says Elder Corwin wishes to discuss the terms of the bloodline claim directly." Kale's mouth went dry. He had known this moment might come, had braced himself for it in the quiet hours when sleep wouldn't come easily. But knowing it was possible and facing it directly were entirely different weights to carry. The main hall, when they arrived, already held a tense atmosphere thick enough to feel against the skin. Draven stood near the raised dais at the far end, his posture rigid, while a small group of Thornridge representatives waited near the entrance, flanked by two of Iron Fang's own guards. Kale recognized none of the envoys' faces, though their bearing carried the same practiced authority he remembered from Thornridge's elders. A woman at the front of the group stepped forward as Kale entered, her sharp eyes assessing him with clinical interest that made his skin crawl uncomfortably. "So this is the Hearthbound Omega," she said, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Elder Corwin sends his regrets for the confusion at our last meeting. Had he understood the full value of what Thornridge was releasing, matters would have proceeded quite differently." "The matter is settled," Draven said, his voice carrying an edge of warning. "Kale is under Iron Fang's protection. That was agreed upon under proper bloodline law." "Agreements can be revisited," the woman said smoothly, "when new information comes to light. Thornridge is prepared to offer generous compensation for the boy's return, land rights along the southern border, trade concessions extending 3 full seasons." Kale felt something cold settle in his chest at how easily she spoke of him, as though he were a piece of property being negotiated over a table rather than a person standing directly in front of her. The old familiar shame threatened to rise, the instinct to shrink smaller, to accept that his worth had always been, and would always be measured entirely by what others could gain from him. But then he felt Ash press against his leg, steady and warm, and he remembered the way 6 abandoned pups had chosen him, without any negotiation at all, simply because he had offered them gentleness when no one else would. "I'm not for sale," Kale said, his voice quieter than he intended but carrying clearly enough through the hushed hall. The Thornridge envoy's sharp eyes turned toward him, clearly startled that the boy they had come to negotiate over would speak for himself at all. "This isn't your decision to make. Bloodline claims are settled between packs, not by the individual in question." "Then perhaps that law needs revisiting too," Draven said coldly, stepping forward to place himself slightly between Kale and the envoy without making the movement look deliberate. Kale made his choice clear. He does not wish to return to Thornridge. "I'd suggest you carry that answer back to Corwin, along with a reminder that Iron Fang does not respond well to pressure disguised as negotiation." The envoy's composure flickered, just slightly, before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. "Elder Corwin will not be pleased to hear his generous offer refused so quickly. Elder Corwin threw this boy into a yard full of feral pups expecting him to be harmed, possibly killed, simply to prove a point about his worth," Draven said, his voice hardening further. "He forfeited any claim to generosity the moment he made that decision. Tell him I said so directly." A tense silence stretched across the hall, broken only when the envoy, apparently recognizing that further negotiation would gain nothing, gave a stiff nod, and turned to gather her small delegation. "This isn't finished," she said, pausing at the threshold. "Corwin won't let this rest quietly, not once the full council understands what's been lost." "Let him try," Draven said evenly. "Iron Fang will be ready." The envoy left without further response, the heavy hall doors closing behind her small delegation with a sound that echoed uncomfortably in the sudden quiet. Kale let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his legs suddenly unsteady beneath him. Draven turned toward him immediately, concern replacing the hard authority he had carried throughout the confrontation. "Are you all right?" Draven asked quietly. "They talked about me like I was a piece of land," Kale said, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. "Like my whole worth could be measured in trade concessions. That's what Thornridge has always done," Draven said gently. "It's not the truth of who you are. It's simply the limit of what they were ever capable of seeing." Kale looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of the same calculation the envoy had carried, and found only steady, genuine concern. "Thank you," Kale said quietly, "for not letting them decide for me." "You decided for yourself," Draven said. "I simply made sure they heard it." Around them, the pups shifted restlessly, sensing the tension slowly beginning to ease from the room, and Kale allowed himself, cautiously, to hope that Corwin's threats might remain nothing more than words. He would soon learn how wrong that hope truly was. A full week passed without further word from Thornridge, and slowly, cautiously, life within Iron Fang's walls began to settle into something resembling ordinary rhythm. The pups grew stronger with each passing day, their ribs no longer visible beneath healthy coats, their eyes brighter, their play more energetic than fearful. Kale found himself smiling more often than he had in years, watching Wisp chase her tail in clumsy circles, or Ash wrestle playfully with his littermates in the training yard's soft grass. He had begun, tentatively, to feel something he barely recognized. Not simply safety, though that alone was new enough to marvel at, but something closer to belonging. Elena continued their morning lessons, teaching him gradually to understand the shape of his own gift, how to sense a wolf's distress before it became visible, how to offer calm without exhausting himself in the process. Finn had taken to including him in small tasks around the stronghold, nothing demanding, simply small ways of weaving him into the daily fabric of pack life that Kale had never been permitted to be part of at Thornridge. And Draven, though burdened constantly by the responsibilities of leading a territory still recovering from the raid that had taken 3 of his warriors, made a point of seeking Kale out each evening, sharing quiet meals together as the pups settled around them, exhausted from a full day of play. "You seem lighter today," Draven observed one evening, watching Kale laugh softly as Wisp attempted, unsuccessfully, to climb onto his lap while balancing a small stick in her mouth. "I feel lighter," Kale admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. "I didn't know it was possible to feel this way, safe enough to just exist, without waiting for something to go wrong." Draven's expression carried something warm, though tinged faintly with concern. "I'm glad you feel that way. But I don't want you to mistake this quiet for the danger being gone entirely. Corwin's silence worries me more than his threats did." Kale's smile faded slightly, old wariness creeping back in. "You think he's planning something?" "I think a man who values pride as much as Corwin doesn't simply accept losing something valuable without a plan to reclaim it eventually." Draven's jaw tightened. "I've doubled the Eastern patrols regardless. I won't let my guard down, even if the days feel calm." His caution proved justified only 2 days later. Kale woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices echoing through the stronghold's courtyard, sharp and urgent enough to pull him immediately from sleep. The pups woke with him, ears pricked toward the commotion, and Ash let out a low growl that vibrated with unfamiliar tension. Kale dressed quickly and made his way toward the courtyard, where a small crowd had already gathered around a returning patrol, several of the warriors bearing visible signs of a scuffle, though thankfully nothing that looked severely dangerous. Finn stood near the center of the group, his expression grim as he addressed Draven, who had emerged from the main hall still fastening the last clasp of his outer coat. "A group tried to cross the eastern border during the night," Finn was saying as Kale approached. "Not a large force, 6, maybe 7. Our patrol caught them before they made it past the outer tree line." "Thornridge?" Draven asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Confirmed. One of them carried Corwin's personal seal." Finn's expression darkened further. "They weren't dressed for a diplomatic visit, Alpha. They were equipped for a retrieval mission." Kale's blood ran cold at the implication. Retrieval meant they had intended to take him back by force, regardless of the bloodline law Draven had cited so confidently in the negotiation hall days earlier. "Where are they now?" Draven asked. "Detained, refusing to speak, beyond confirming they were sent under Corwin's direct order." Finn hesitated before continuing. "Alpha, this changes things. An attempted incursion onto Iron Fang territory, specifically targeting a protected bond. That's grounds for the Pack Council to intervene directly. If we bring this before them formally, Corwin's position could be seriously weakened." Draven's expression shifted through several calculations before settling into something resolute. "Then we bring it before them. I won't let this rest as a quiet border skirmish that fades from memory. Corwin needs to understand there are consequences for treating people as property to be reclaimed whenever convenient." Kale stepped forward finally, drawing both men's attention. "This happened because of me." "This happened because Corwin refuses to accept that his cruelty has consequences," Draven corrected firmly. "None of this is your fault, Kale. Don't let his actions convince you otherwise." But the fear settling in Kale's chest was harder to dismiss than Draven's reassurance allowed for. He thought of the pups, of Wisp and Ash, and the 4 others who had only just begun to feel safe again, and the thought of Thornridge succeeding in dragging him back, of undoing everything fragile and good that had been built over the past 2 weeks, made his hands tremble. "What happens now?" Kale asked quietly. "Now," Draven said, his voice firm with a kind of resolve that steadied something uneasy in Kale's chest. "I formally request an audience with the full Pack Council. I present the evidence of tonight's incursion, along with the bloodline claim and everything Thornridge has done to violate it. And I make sure every pack within the Council's reach understands exactly what kind of leader Corwin has proven himself to be. Elena, who had joined the gathering partway through the conversation, nodded slowly. The Council convenes at the central gathering grounds twice yearly, but incursions of this nature can call for an emergency session. Given tonight's events, I believe we have more than enough grounds to request one. Then we request it, Draven said. Today. Kale watched the resolve settle across every face gathered in that courtyard, watched a pack rally around him with a fierceness he had never once experienced at Thornridge, and felt something shift deep within his chest, something that had been buried under years of quiet dismissal finally beginning to loosen. He was not simply being protected because of some rare bloodline gift, though that gift had certainly opened the door. He was being protected because, in the short time he had spent among them, this pack had come to see him as someone worth protecting for his own sake. Ash pressed against his leg, steady and warm, and Kale reached down to rest his hand against the pup's back, drawing strength from the same simple gesture that had first calmed him weeks earlier, in a yard meant to destroy him instead. Whatever Corwin intended next, Kale would not face it as the Wolfless Omega thrown away without a second thought. He would face it as someone an entire pack had chosen to stand beside. The central gathering ground sat exactly between the territories of every pack within the wider council's reach, a wide open field ringed by ancient stones said to have marked pack boundaries long before written treaties existed. Kale had never traveled this far from either Thornridge or Ironfang before, and the sheer scale of the gathering, dozens of pack representatives arriving from every direction, left him feeling smaller than he had in weeks. Draven rode beside him for the entire 3-day journey, along with Finn, Elena, and a modest escort of Ironfang warriors, while the 6 pups remained back at the stronghold under careful watch, considered too young and vulnerable to bring into what promised to be a tense confrontation. "You don't have to speak, if you'd rather not," Draven said quietly as they approached the gathering grounds, the murmur of assembling packs already audible in the distance. "I can present the evidence and the bloodline claim myself." "I need to speak," Kale said, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "If I stay silent, it lets them keep treating this like something happening around me instead of something happening to me. I want them to hear it directly." Draven studied him for a long moment before nodding, something like quiet pride settling across his features. "Then I'll stand beside you while you do." The council convened beneath a large open pavilion at the center of the grounds, elders and representatives from a dozen packs arranged in a wide circle, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical, as Draven's party approached. Kale spotted Elder Corwin immediately among the Thornridge delegation, his expression carrying the same cold authority Kale remembered from the enclosure weeks earlier, though something beneath it looked tighter now, more strained. An elderly woman seated at the head of the circle, introduced as Council Elder Ruth, called the session to order with a raised hand that silenced the assembled murmurs almost instantly. "We convene today at Alpha King Draven's request, regarding an alleged incursion onto Ironfang territory, and a disputed bloodline claim," Ruth said, her voice carrying easily despite its age-worn roughness. "Alpha Draven, you may present your case." Draven stepped forward, his presentation methodical and unhurried, laying out the timeline exactly as it had happened. The raid on his eastern border weeks earlier, the stolen pups, the discovery of Kale calming them in Thornridge's enclosure, the bloodline law cited and agreed upon at the time, and finally, the attempted incursion just days ago, carried out under Corwin's own seal. Several council members leaned forward with visible interest, as Finn presented physical evidence of the incursion, including the recovered seal itself, passed carefully around the circle for inspection. "This is a clear violation," one representative said, his voice sharp with disapproval. "Bloodline protection law exists specifically to prevent exactly this kind of forced reclamation." Corwin rose from his seat before further discussion could continue, his expression tight with barely restrained frustration. "The council fails to understand the full context. This bloodline was hidden within Thornridge for years, unrecognized and undocumented. Ironfang benefits enormously from a resource that rightfully originated within Thornridge's own pack lines." "A resource," Kale repeated, the words leaving his mouth before he fully decided to speak them, cutting cleanly through Corwin's careful framing. Every eye in the pavilion turned toward him, and Kale felt his pulse quicken, but he did not let the sudden attention silence him the way it once would have. "You call me a resource," Kale continued, stepping forward slightly. "But for 18 years, Thornridge called me broken. Worthless. A wolfless omega not even worth feeding properly some winters, because why waste resources on something that would never contribute anything back? His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through it. You only decided I was valuable the moment someone else recognized what you never bothered to look for. That's not a claim to ownership. That's proof of exactly how little you ever cared to understand me. The pavilion fell into a heavy silence, several council members exchanging uncomfortable glances. Corwin's jaw tightened, his composure fraying at the edges under the weight of the accusation laid bare in front of his peers. Council Elder Ruth, Draven said into the silence, his voice steady. I'd ask the council to consider not only the letter of bloodline law, but the spirit of it. That law exists to protect vulnerable bonds from exploitation. Thornridge's own actions, both years of neglect and a recent attempted forced retrieval, demonstrate exactly the kind of exploitation this law was written to prevent. Ruth's sharp eyes moved slowly between Draven, Cale, and Corwin, weighing the testimony with the careful deliberation of someone who had clearly navigated many such disputes before. The evidence presented is compelling, she said finally. An attempted incursion, carried out under an elder's direct seal, in clear violation of an already agreed bloodline claim, cannot be dismissed as simple misunderstanding. Corwin opened his mouth to protest further, but Ruth raised her hand again, silencing him with practiced ease. The council finds in favor of Ironfang's claim, Ruth announced, her voice carrying finality across the assembled circle. The bond between Cale and the Hearthbound Pups is confirmed under full council authority, no longer subject to dispute or challenge from Thornridge or any other pack. Furthermore, given the severity of the attempted incursion, Thornridge will face formal sanction, effective immediately, restricting border privileges for one full season. A murmur rippled through the assembled representatives, some nodding in clear approval, others watching Corwin's reaction with poorly concealed interest. Corwin's face had gone pale, the weight of the council's judgment settling visibly across his rigid shoulders. Cale felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had carried since the moment the envoy first arrived at Ironfang's gates finally beginning to ease. It was not simply relief at winning the dispute. It was something deeper, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen clearly, of having his worth acknowledged, not because of what he could offer others, but because of the harm done to him being recognized as real. This isn't over, Corwin muttered, low enough that only those nearby could hear, before turning sharply and leaving the pavilion with the remainder of his delegation trailing uncomfortably behind him. Draven watched him go, his expression carefully neutral, though Cale caught the faint tightening around his eyes that suggested he did not fully believe Corwin's parting words were empty either. You did that, Draven said quietly, turning back toward Cale once the Thornridge delegation had fully departed. You stood in front of an entire council and made them see exactly what happened to you. That took more courage than most warriors I've trained. Cale let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly beginning to fade, leaving something quieter and steadier in its place. I just told the truth. Sometimes, Draven said, that's the hardest thing anyone can do. Around them, the gathering ground slowly began dispersing, representatives returning to their respective delegations, the tension of the confrontation gradually settling into the ordinary business of a council session concluding. Cale stood amid it all, feeling, for the first time in his entire life, that his voice had mattered enough to change something. Whatever Corwin's parting threat meant, Cale would face it knowing the council itself now stood behind him. He was no longer simply the wolfless Omega Thornridge had thrown away. He was someone whose worth an entire gathering of packs had finally, formally acknowledged. The journey back to Ironfang carried a lightness Cale had not expected, though Draven's watchfulness never fully eased, even with the council's ruling settled firmly in their favor. Cale noticed the way Draven's gaze swept the tree line more often than necessary, the way Finn kept the escort tighter than the outbound journey had required. You still think Corwin will try something, Cale said on the second evening of their return journey, watching the fire crackle between them as the rest of the escort settled into their evening routines around the camp. I think a man who just lost standing in front of every pack council representative doesn't simply accept that loss gracefully, Draven admitted. Corwin built his authority on control. Losing you, losing the council's confidence, losing face in front of his peers. That's not a small wound to his pride. Men like that often lash out hardest when they're cornered. Cale pulled his cloak tighter against the evening chill, considering the weight of that warning. What would he even have left to gain, though? The council ruling was clear. Even if he took me by force, he couldn't hold that claim legitimately. Legitimacy isn't always what men like Corwin care about most, Draven said grimly. Sometimes it's simply about not being the one who lost. They reached Ironfang's stronghold on the fourth day, and Cale felt an unexpected warmth settle in his chest at the sight of the pale stone walls rising against the horizon. Warmth that had nothing to do with relief at ending a long journey, and everything to do with recognizing, for the first time, that a place could feel like home. The pups greeted them at the gates with an enthusiasm that nearly knocked Cale off his feet, 6 bodies colliding against his legs in a chaotic tangle of joyful barks and eager tails. Wisp managed to climb halfway up his leg before Cale scooped her properly into his arms, laughing as she pressed her small face against his neck. "They missed you," Elena observed, smiling faintly at the reunion. "Refused to eat properly the entire time you were gone, no matter how we tried to coax them." "They'll be all right now," Cale said, settling onto the ground despite his travel-worn state, allowing all 6 pups to pile around him in a tangle of relieved affection. That night, for the first time since the council session, Cale allowed himself to sleep without the low hum of anxiety that had followed him since Thornridge's envoy first arrived weeks earlier. The stronghold felt secure, the pups were healthy, and the council's ruling stood firmly behind him. He should have known better than to let his guard down so completely. He woke to the sound of Ash growling low and sharp beside his bed, the pup's body rigid with alertness, ears pinned flat against his skull. Cale sat up immediately, disoriented in the darkness, and it took him a moment to register the faint smell of smoke drifting through his open window. "Fire," he breathed, scrambling out of bed just as shouts began echoing through the courtyard below. He dressed hastily and rushed toward the window, where he could see flickering orange light rising from the direction of the stronghold's western storage buildings, figures moving frantically against the growing glow as Iron Fang warriors rushed to contain the blaze. Cale's first instinct was panic, but beneath it, a colder realization began forming. A fire breaking out in the dead of night, in a stronghold that had been on heightened alert for weeks, felt far too convenient to be accidental. He gathered the pups quickly, ushering them toward the door. When Finn appeared in the hallway outside, his expression tight with urgent alarm. "Cale, stay here," Finn said quickly. "The fire's a distraction. We caught movement near the eastern wall, same section as the last incursion attempt." Cale's blood ran cold. "Corwin, we don't know yet, but given the timing, I'd wager on it." Finn's jaw tightened. "Draven's already moved to the eastern wall with a full guard. I need to help coordinate the fire response. Stay with the pups, keep the door barred, and don't open it for anyone but myself or the Alpha directly." Cale nodded, though every instinct screamed against simply hiding while chaos unfolded around him. Finn disappeared down the hallway, and Cale quickly barred the door as instructed, gathering the pups close around him in the dim quiet of his room, while shouts and the distant crackle of flames continued outside. Minutes stretched unbearably long. Cale paced the small room, unable to settle, the pups picking up on his anxiety and growing restless around him. He thought of Draven at the eastern wall, facing whatever threat Corwin had sent under cover of the diversionary fire, and the thought of something happening to him settled like a stone in Cale's chest. He could not simply stay hidden while others faced danger meant, ultimately, for him. Against every instruction Finn had given, Cale carefully unbarred the door and made his way through the smoke-hazed hallways toward the courtyard, the pups trailing anxiously behind him, refusing to be left alone in the room any more than he was willing to remain there himself. The courtyard, when he reached it, was chaos. Warriors rushing between the burning storage building and buckets of water passed hand to hand in a desperate line, while shouts from the eastern wall carried faintly over the din. Cale pushed through the confusion, following the sound of raised voices, his heart hammering with a fear that had nothing to do with the flames behind him. He reached the eastern wall just as a group of intruders, no more than 8, were being forced back by Iron Fang's guards, blades flashing in the torchlight, though thankfully no serious wounds visible yet on either side. Draven stood at the center of the defense, his expression carved from cold fury, as he faced down a figure Cale recognized immediately despite the darkness. Elder Corwin himself, sword in hand, his face twisted with the kind of desperate determination that came from a man who had already lost everything else he valued, and had nothing left to protect but his pride. "You've lost, Corwin," Draven said, his voice carrying easily across the tense standoff. "The council ruled against you. This attack only proves exactly what kind of leader you truly are." "The council doesn't understand what's at stake," Corwin spat, his composure fraying visibly. "A bloodline like that under Iron Fang's control shifts everything. I won't let Thornridge fade into irrelevance, because a Wolfless boy happened to stumble into value we should have recognized generations ago." Cale stepped forward before he fully decided to, drawing every eye in the standoff toward him, including Draven's, whose expression shifted immediately from cold fury to sharp alarm at seeing him exposed in the middle of an active confrontation. "Cale, get back," Draven said urgently. But Cale did not retreat. He looked directly at Corwin, At the man who had spent his entire childhood calling him broken, who had thrown him into a yard expecting him to be harmed simply to prove a point, and felt something steady settle into his chest despite the danger surrounding him. "You had 18 years to see value in me," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "You never looked. Don't pretend now that this is about Thornridge's honor. This is about you refusing to accept that you were wrong." Corwin's face contorted with fury, and for one terrible moment, Cale thought he might actually lunge forward despite the guards surrounding him. But something in Cale's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to finally break through whatever desperate resolve had carried Corwin this far, and his shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining visibly from his posture. "Stand down," Draven ordered sharply, and the remaining Thornridge intruders, recognizing the hopelessness of their position surrounded by Ironfang's guards, slowly lowered their weapons. Corwin remained standing a moment longer, his sword still gripped tightly, before finally letting it fall to the ground with a heavy, final clatter. "This changes nothing," Corwin said, though the words carried none of the authority they once might have. "Thornridge will remember this. Then let them remember it as the moment their elder chose violence over accountability," Draven said coldly, gesturing for his guards to secure the defeated intruders. "The council will hear of tonight's actions as well. I doubt this will improve your standing further." As the guards moved to restrain Corwin and his remaining followers, Cale felt the adrenaline finally begin to drain from his body, leaving him unsteady on his feet. Draven crossed the distance between them quickly, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering worry. "You shouldn't have come out here," Draven said, though his hands, settling gently on Cale's shoulders, carried none of the anger his words suggested. "I couldn't stay hidden while you faced him for me," Cale said quietly. "Not anymore." Draven's expression softened, something warm settling behind his dark eyes despite the chaos still surrounding them. "You've changed so much in these few weeks, from someone who could barely hold eye contact with strangers, to someone standing firm in front of the man who spent years trying to break you." "I had help," Cale said, glancing down at the pups still pressed anxiously around his legs, and then back up at Draven, at the man who had chosen, from the very first moment in that dusty yard, to see him as something worth protecting rather than something worth discarding. Around them, the fire was finally being brought under control, the chaos of the night slowly settling into the quiet aftermath of a threat successfully repelled. Corwin's plan, whatever desperate hope had fueled it, had failed completely, and Cale understood, standing there in the torchlit courtyard, that Thornridge's shadow over his life had finally, truly, begun to lift. News of Corwin's failed incursion reached the Pack Council within days. Carried swiftly by riders, Draven dispatched himself, unwilling to let the story reach Thornridge's allies first, and risk being twisted into something less damning than the truth deserved. Council Elder Ruth's response arrived just as swiftly, a formal summons demanding Corwin appear before the full council to answer for an armed attack launched under cover of arson, a violation far more severe than the earlier attempted retrieval. Cale did not travel for this second council session. Draven insisted he remain safely within Ironfang's walls, and this time, Cale did not argue the point. He had said everything he needed to say already, standing in front of that first council months ago, and standing again in the courtyard against Corwin himself. Whatever judgment the council rendered now belonged to them to deliver, built on evidence that spoke clearly enough without requiring his voice a second time. The verdict, when it arrived, was severe. Corwin was stripped of his position as elder, his authority over Thornridge's council seat revoked permanently, and Thornridge itself placed under a full season of council oversight, meant to ensure no further violations occurred while the pack rebuilt its leadership under new guidance. Miriam, the healer who had once quietly shown Cale small kindnesses, was named as interim elder, a choice Cale found himself unexpectedly relieved by when the news reached him. "She was never cruel to me," Cale said, reading the formal notice Draven had brought to share with him personally. "Maybe Thornridge will be different now." "Maybe," Draven agreed. "Change takes time, especially in a pack that built its habits over generations. But it's a start." Life at Ironfang, meanwhile, had settled into something steadier than Cale had ever imagined possible for himself. The pups continued growing, stronger and more confident with each passing month, their feral edges long since softened into playful, affectionate creatures that trusted easily and loved fiercely. Elena continued teaching Cale the depths of his own gift, and slowly, he began using it not simply to calm the 6 pups who had first found him, but to help other troubled or traumatized wolves brought to Ironfang from across the territory. Wolves who had experienced their own versions of loss and fear, and needed someone patient enough to offer them stillness. Word of his gift spread, not as a rumor of a resource to exploit, but as genuine recognition of a rare and valuable healer, someone capable of reaching minds too broken by grief or violence for ordinary methods to help. Packs began sending word requesting his assistance for their own troubled wolves, and Kale, for the first time, found himself approached not with scorn or dismissal, but with genuine respect for what he could offer. Draven's presence remained a constant throughout it all, steady and unwavering, evolving slowly from protector into something Kale had never quite let himself hope for. Their evenings together grew longer, filled with quiet conversation and comfortable silence in equal measure, until one evening, nearly a year after that first terrible morning in Thornridge's yard, Draven finally spoke the words Kale had begun, cautiously, to hope he might say, "I want you to stay," Draven said simply, the pups dozing peacefully around them near the low fire in his private quarters. Not simply because of the pups or because of some old law protecting a rare bloodline. "I want you to stay because I've come to care for you more deeply than I expected to, more deeply than I've cared for anyone in longer than I can remember." Kale's chest tightened with an emotion he still sometimes struggled to fully trust, the lingering echo of years spent believing he was worth nothing, making even genuine affection feel occasionally unreal. But he had learned, slowly, over the past year, to let himself believe in good things when they were offered honestly. "I want to stay too," Kale said quietly. "I think I have. For a while now. I just needed time to believe it was really mine to choose." Draven's expression softened into something achingly gentle, and he reached out to take Kale's hand carefully in his own. "Then choose it. Choose this. Choose us." Kale did. The formal ceremony took place 3 months later, beneath the pale stone towers of Ironfang, with representatives from a dozen packs in attendance, including, notably, an invitation extended to Thornridge's new interim elder, Miriam, who arrived not with the cold authority Corwin once carried, but with quiet respect and genuine well-wishes for the boy she remembered treating gently, even when few others bothered to. Draven declared Kale his mate before the assembled crowd, formally severing any lingering claim Thornridge might have attempted to revive, and naming him protector of the hearthbound pups and guardian of Ironfang's most vulnerable, a title that carried weight and respect rather than the dismissal Kale had spent his childhood expecting from any title attached to his name. The 6 pups, now grown healthy and strong, sat proudly at the front of the gathered crowd throughout the ceremony, Wisp pressed against Kale's leg, exactly as she had been on that very first day, and Ash standing tall beside him, torn ear and all, a living reminder of everything Kale had survived, and everything he had ultimately built from the wreckage of what Thornridge tried to throw away. Standing there, surrounded by a pack that had chosen him fully, beside a man who had seen his worth from the very first moment in that dusty yard, Kale thought back to the boy who had once believed himself broken beyond redemption, wolfless and worthless in the eyes of everyone who should have loved him unconditionally. That boy had been wrong, not about the wolf he never gained, but about the worth he had always carried quietly within himself, waiting only for someone patient enough, kind enough, to finally see it clearly. He was no longer the wolfless Omega thrown to feral pups expecting nothing but harm. He was Kale, hearthbound protector, mate to the Alpha King, the heart that had, against every expectation, changed an entire pack's understanding of what true strength could look like. And as Draven pulled him close beneath the setting sun, surrounded by the pups who had found him first, and the pack that had learned to love him after, Kale finally understood, completely and without doubt, that he had never truly been thrown away at all. He had simply been waiting for the right place to land,